Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. For the last couple episodes, we've talked about U.S. pop culture in 1985 from January through August, laying the groundwork for today's discussion of the Beach Boys' 1985 self-titled album, The Beach Boys, which was released on June 10th, 1985. It was the Beach Boys' first new album in 5 years, and a lot had changed over those 5 years. We were now in an era of synthesizers, electronic keyboards, big gated drums, big giant hairdos, day-glow colors. A lot had changed since 1980 and keeping the summer alive. Not only was this their first new album in 5 years, it was the first since the loss of Dennis. It was the first recorded digitally. It was the first original Beach Boy album released on vinyl as well as the new medium of CD. And it turned out to be their last record for CBS. Possibly as a reaction to all this change, the Beach Boys used an outside producer for the first time since Nick Vinay had been credited on Surfing USA way back in 1963. The producer was Steve Levine, best known for his work as producer of the red hot act Culture Club, which was churning out massive hits during this period. Steve Levine would go on to produce other acts, of course, including a co-production credit on 3 of the tracks on the Beckley, Lamb, Carl Wilson album, Like a Brother. But if you read anything about Steve Levine, even to this day, it's bound to say Culture Club producer either before or after his name, sort of like Beatles producer George Martin. He remains highly associated with Culture Club. In fact, if there is a second credit mentioned, it's usually the 1985 Beach Boys album. Levine had apparently come to the Beach Boys through Bruce Johnston, who'd known him when Levine was working at CBS Records in the late 70s. And I remember at the time there was a lot of coverage in the press long before the album was released that the Beach Boys were using the Culture Club producer to update and modernize their sound, and that the new album would feature a song written by Boy George O'Dowd and Roy Hay of Culture Club, as well as a track written by Stevie Wonder. My initial reaction to the new producer and to this news was not negative. I thought this was a good idea. I was not looking forward to Keeping the Summer Alive Volume 2. I thought it was really exciting and interesting if they changed their sound up, and I also thought it was really necessary at this point. I really thought this could potentially herald a big new era of Beach Boy records, so I found the initial news encouraging. Because of all this focus on Levine, I might possibly give him more credit or blame, as the case may be, for the resulting album than he deserves. A lot of time I'm not sure what part of the decision making was down to band members and what part was down to Steve Levine and his crew. But let's take a look at the album now, track by track, beginning with the lead-off track and also the first single, Get You Back. The single, Get You Back, was released on May 8th, 1985. It would eventually go to number 26 on June 29th, 1985. The obligatory music video for the single received a good amount of airplay on MTV, which gave it both needed exposure and credibility in the music world of 1985. And as a single, I thought it was a great choice. It's at once modern and retro, and kind of what I thought a realistic, best-case scenario Beach Boys single would sound like in 1985. The opening program drum is slightly reminiscent of Don't Worry Baby and, in turn, the Ronettes' Be My Baby, without being an exact copy of it or really demanding that the listener notice it. It's just a slight callback for those who happen to hear it. The lyrics are a little reminiscent of Do It Again without any direct reference to it or any other Beach Boys work. And under the circumstances, I think it's easy to infer that the lyric Get You Back could also be applied to the Beach Boys getting back their audience, which is fair and effective. The track also sets the tone for the album. You've certainly got 80s production here. There's Fairlight and or drum programming by Levine on every track on the album. And I think this is the key decision that Levine made and was correct about. He never lets the backing tracks overwhelm the vocals and the harmonies. He keeps that balance throughout. He keeps the focus on the Beach Boys vocals, which after all is a lot of what we're listening to the Beach Boys for. And on this track, it's very effective. Mike has a little bit of that sort of nasal, affected sound that has dogged a lot of his work in the 80s, but it's toned down a little bit to a tolerable level here. The real breakthrough is Brian sounds stronger than he has in probably a decade, and we even get a falsetto vocal from him, which we thought we might never see again at this point. The second track on the album was also the second single. It's Getting Late, which is a Carl Wilson Myrna Smith Schilling composition. Of course, Carl and Myrna had collaborated in writing Carl's 2 solo albums a few years earlier. This track is also credited to songwriter Robert White Johnson. It's one of my favorite tracks on the album. It's one of the strongest Wilson Smith Schilling compositions, I think. Now, whether they held back a strong composition for the Beach Boys album or whether Robert White Johnson's contribution brought it into focus, I'm not really sure. But suffice to say, it's a real highlight. And I actually like the 80s production on this very much. It doesn't detract from it at all. It was released as a single on July 17, 1985. It eventually went to number 82 on the charts. The next track, Crack at Your Love, is the first of the Brian Wilson compositions on this. It was initially credited to Brian Wilson, Al Jardine, and Eugene E. Landy. Now, Landy's writing credits on this album were later removed, but the original credit includes Landy. And I have to say, it's a terrible title. Crack at Your Love. They could have called it Chance at Your Love. That would have made it a little bit better, but it's a goofy title. The track itself is not too bad. I particularly like the bridge where it's Lonely Nights, Lonely Days. That I think is very beautiful. But the title really puts me off. And I'm not sure, I tend to blame that title on Landy because he wrote some terrible lyrics, seemingly. But Brian can also write some awkward lyrics, so I'm not sure why it's Crack at Your Love. It's a pretty good track. Al does a nice vocal on it, but I really can't get past that title somehow. That's followed by another Carl Wilson, Myrna Smith Schilling composition, Maybe I Don't Know. And this is possibly my favorite track on it. Again, it has some additional songwriting credits. Steve Levine and his associate Julian Stewart Lindsay are credited. Carl provides a great vocal on the thing, and what really sets it apart is the lead guitar played by Gary Moore. That really makes it distinctive, really makes it stand out. I wouldn't swear to it, but I really think this might possibly be my favorite track on the whole album. Closing out side one is Bruce Johnston's contribution as a songwriter, She Believes in Love Again. It's got a very beautiful vocal by Bruce and also by Carl. It's got a beautiful melody. I would have preferred that they come up with something a little bit stronger for a vocal refrain than She Believes in Love Again, She Believes in Me, which to me is kind of like a adult-oriented, sort of meaningless song sentiment. Doesn't really affect me in any way, and it doesn't sound like it really affected Bruce in any particular way. I would certainly take the lyrics to Disney Girls over this anytime. But it's still a very nice song with that little caveat. Here's where I really think the 80s production hurts it. They really should have gone with acoustic instruments on this. I think the 80s production here really detracts from the song. I would have loved to have heard it on an acoustic piano, which I presume is probably the way Bruce wrote it. Now, I'm not sure if they thought it really sounded better that way in 1985, or if they just thought it wouldn't fit in with the rest of the album if it was all acoustic instruments. But this is certainly one instance where I think the 80s production really detracts from the song. In September, this became the third and final single from the album, and I believe the first Beach Boys A-side written by Bruce Johnston. Unfortunately, it didn't chart. That brings us to the end of side one, and all in all, it's a pretty strong album side from the Beach Boys in 1985. Kicking off side two is California Calling, an Al Jardine, Brian Wilson composition. And if you've watched this channel very much, you probably can guess this is my least favorite song on the album. A lot of people love it, I understand that. There's a lot of boosters for this song. People say it should have been released as a single. It might have been a hit. That's certainly a possibility. But to me, this is the Beach Boys engaging in self-parody, going over their back catalog and doing the things that people expect from them rather than what they want to do, which is sing about fun in the sun and surf and California and all that. It's almost maniacally cheerful, and to my ears, they sound uncommitted. It's really not that much better than a sitcom soundtrack that would play in the background when the gang goes to the beach in some episode. Additionally, when they use the term totally rad to try to sound current, it's as awkward to me nearly as The Who posing with an Atari machine on the 1982 album It's Hard to try to look current. It's just a little awkward. Now, I understand that they're trying to tie 50s slang to 60s slang to 80s slang, but it still seems a little off, and the fact that they put the lyrics in quotation marks, totally rad, inside the enclosed lyric sheet also makes it seem like they were a little uncomfortable with that. Additionally, and speaking of the lyric sheet, does anybody have any idea why every time the word ultimate appears inside this lyric sheet for California Calling, the word ultimate is underlined. Always wondered about that. I doubt anybody has any insight into that, but it just seems weird to me that the word ultimate is underlined throughout the lyrics for California Calling. Now, I did notice on the hype sticker that originally came on the album, they list Get You Back, California Calling, and She Believes in Love Again. And I have a theory, and this is just a theory based on nothing other than what I happen to think. But I believe that when they released Get You Back as a single, if it had tanked, because it's a little bit progressive, if it had gone down in flames, California Calling would have been the second single. As it was, Get You Back went to number 26, which was not too shabby, so they went with the more progressive It's Getting Late, which I'm sure made Carl happy, being that it was his song and also he was still pushing for a more progressive direction for the group at this time. Again, just a thought, just a guess. By the way, I've kept all my hype stickers going back to the mid-70s. I've got them all in a big envelope, and I realize I should start showing those when it's appropriate. I'm also thinking about possibly at some point doing an episode where I hold up the hype sticker and you try to tell me what album it came from. There are some of them that say contains the hits and then lists something you've never heard of. Even I've never heard of it, and I actually bought the album. So it could pose something of a challenge and could be kind of fun. I'll think about doing that. Let me know if you think that might be interesting. Anyway, let's get back to the Beach Boys. Second track on side 2 is Passing Friend. This is the contribution written by Boy George O'Dowd and Roy Hay from Culture Club. Roy Hay provides all the instrumentation apart from saxophone and Fairlight and drum programming, which were provided by Steve Levine. Now, people have said that this is kind of a cast-off Culture Club track. I don't think that that's really true. I mean, I know that artists often hold back their best material for themselves and contribute a lesser song to another artist. Paul McCartney has admitted as much that he's done that in the past. But I really think here they were trying to establish themselves as writers. And by contributing a strong composition to a legendary act like the Beach Boys, it might have enhanced their status, so to speak. While the Beach Boys may have been using Culture Club to try to sound current, I think Culture Club was trying to use the Beach Boys as a springboard to establish their cred in the rock and roll hierarchy. I could really see Passing Friend making a strong Culture Club A-side. Unfortunately, it just didn't fit the Beach Boys particularly well. Carl does a great job with the vocal, but we know Carl could sing the phone book and make it sound good. Al was not a particular fan of the track. He said that that and the Stevie Wonder song were just given to them by the producer who said you are going to record these, that the band had no hand in choosing that material. He had a little more affection, of course, for the Stevie Wonder song, which is understandable, but Al was certainly not a fan. Next up, we have another Brian Wilson, Gene Landy composition, I'm So Lonely. Brian seemed to have some particular affection for this track, having performed it at the Malibu Emergency Room benefit in May of 1985. Apparently, during the recording of this track, according to the 1991 Wouldn't It Be Nice book, there was a big blow-up in the studio between Steve Levine and apparently Gene Landy. In the book, Levine is described as having tedious dictatorial work habits that were driving everyone crazy. And apparently there was an attempt to pull a fast one on Levine by getting him out of the studio for lunch and having Brian record vocals with the group for this track while Levine was out. Levine returned early and there was a big heated argument apparently between Landy and Levine. This apparently also occurred on the same day that there was a blow-up between Landy and Mike Love over the lyrics to Male Ego, which we'll talk about later. As for the track itself, I think the production here is trying to take a simple track and make it more complicated than it needs to be to try to build it up into something bigger than it really is, and it shows. And here again, it would have been nice for them to go acoustic on it. It should have been left a nice, simple, little unpretentious thing. It might have made a nice album closer. Unfortunately, they really already had a pretty good album closer with It's Just a Matter of Time. But I almost think there's some sort of obfuscation going on by Steve Levine's overblown production of what should have remained a simple track. Next up is a Carl Wilson, Robert White Johnson composition, Where I Belong, which a lot of people, including David Leaf, have said is probably the best track on the album. I can see that. It's got beautiful vocals led by Carl and Al with the group. Really, if you're looking for beautiful harmonies, beautiful vocals, Look No Further Than Where I Belong. To me, there's no real hook to it. I often forget about it because it's kind of so ethereal that there's nothing really to hook me in on it. But I won't dispute that it is a beautiful track, and if that's your favorite track on the album, I won't argue with you because there is a lot of beauty there in Where I Belong. Next up is the Stevie Wonder composition I Do Love You, which features all instrumentation by Stevie Wonder except for the inevitable Fairlight programming, which is by Steve Levine. This is a great track, really a highlight for me. Carl and Al turn in wonderful vocal performances. Stevie Wonder's very distinctive harmonica punctuates the song throughout. And I love the choruses, I love the verses, I love the bridge, each individually. Each section of this song is beautiful. Incidentally, this was one of 3 Beach Boys songs featured in the mix that I put together for my wedding reception. The other 2 being Wouldn't It Be Nice and Our Sweet Love from the Sunflower album. Not that it's my 3rd favorite Beach Boys song or in my top 3, seem to fit the occasion, and this is a song that really sticks with me. Now, some people have said that, like the Culture Club song, this doesn't really suit the Beach Boys. It's a good Stevie Wonder song. But, you know, the Beach Boys have a bit of a history with Stevie Wonder. Having covered I Was Made to Love Her on the Wild Honey album, to me this fits the Beach Boys just fine. The final track on the album is It's Just a Matter of Time, which was credited to Brian Wilson and Gene Landy originally, later credited to Brian Wilson and Mike Love. It's a simple track, and in this case, it's kept simple, which is appropriate for the album closer. Very nice. Nice lead vocal shared by Brian and Mike with the group. Good way to close out the album. The CD, however, contained a bonus track tacked on at the end called Male Ego. It was also released as the B-side of the Get You Back single, which was great for people like me that didn't own a CD player in 1985. And according to the book, Wouldn't It Be Nice?, there was a blow-up over this track. As you might guess, there was apparently some pushback from Mike on the lyrics. Of course, it wasn't the first time that lyrics concerning ego had brought dissent from within the group. In the Wouldn't It Be Nice book, it's presented that Mike objected to the lyrics, but refused an offer to do a rewrite with Landy, saying he would only work with Brian alone. The lyrics are pretty terrible. Mike is credited on the final track along with Brian and Landy, so maybe he did help with a rewrite. I hate to think what it would have sounded like before a rewrite. I really sense the hand of Gene Landy in lyrics about male ego. In any case, I suspect that it was the Landy connection that landed this as a CD bonus track and the B-side of Get You Back rather than a proper album track. Incidentally, I know this book is not considered to be the most reliable narrative of all time, but in the page or so that it talks about the Beach Boys' '85 album, I think it does point out some of the tensions that were going on and how those tensions may have shaped the resulting album. The album sold better than any Beach Boy album since 15 Big Ones, which really only points out that Beach Boy albums after 15 Big Ones didn't sell all that well. It only reached number 52 on the charts. The reviews were mixed. Rolling Stone called it a pretty entertaining album, though not a world-beating act of artistic reassertion. The LP does serve to showcase those amazing voices and to remind the world that nobody does it better, still. And they called it a pleasantly innocuous, undemanding, and mildly enjoyable album. Brian said he admired the technical perfection of the album, but again, coming from the Wouldn't It Be Nice book, he says he didn't hear any human qualities in the music. At the time, Carl was quoted as saying, "We really haven't done our best work in the recent past. It just feels really good to do a good job and put a lot of work into it." In his autobiography, Mike Love says the album was another example of them competing against their former selves. The Beach Boys records, regardless of quality, did not meet the expectations or interest of their fans. Steve Levine says he remains immensely proud of his work on the album, which to me has an unnecessary tone of defensiveness about it. Though the album is strangely overlooked today, it's sometimes just dismissed as cold and sterile or just summed up as being competent but uninspired. I think whatever else, Beach Boys '85 certainly has some great points to it and deserves more attention, maybe a fresh listen if you haven't heard it in a while. There's some very worthwhile things here. Hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know what you think of the album. I know you're going to dissent with me on some of those things, and I expect that, and I always love to hear your take on it. So please comment, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.